The Soviet Union did not collapse because it was invaded, outspent, or technologically inferior. It collapsed because its system was designed to suppress feedback. At its peak, it appeared stable, powerful, and permanent. But every mechanism that preserved control made adaptation impossible. This video is not about ideology. It's about how systems that fear information eventually destroy themselves. In 1985, the Soviet Union controlled 1/6 of the world's land mass. It had survived World War II, built the world's largest tank force, and put the first human in space. 20,000 nuclear warheads guaranteed its security. 6 years later, it no longer existed. This is not a story about outside pressure. This is about a system that consumed itself. A structure so rigid that its own strength became its weakness. Where the mechanisms designed to preserve stability guaranteed collapse. The question isn't why the Soviet Union fell. The question is, why did no one inside the system see it coming? To understand the collapse, you need to understand what the system was designed to do. The Soviet structure emerged from a specific problem: how to transform an agrarian empire into an industrial power without relying on market mechanisms. The solution was central planning. Every factory, every farm, every resource allocation would be decided by planners in Moscow. The State Planning Committee, Gosplan, received data from below and sent directives back down. On paper, this eliminated waste. In practice, it created something else entirely. The system had 3 core components. First, output targets. Every unit, factory, farm, ministry, received quantitative goals. Tons of steel, meters of fabric, barrels of oil. Meeting the target meant survival. Missing it meant consequences. Second, vertical reporting. Information flowed upward through layers of bureaucracy. Each layer filtered, adjusted, and repackaged the data before passing it along. By the time numbers reached Moscow, they had been transformed. Third, loyalty over competence. Managers were selected not for innovation, but for reliability. The system rewarded those who delivered reports that aligned with expectations. Those who raised problems were problems themselves. For decades, this worked. Industrial output grew. The military expanded. The system appeared stable. But stability and sustainability are not the same thing. Every system operates on assumptions. Most remain invisible until they fail. The Soviet structure rested on 3. Assumption 1, more input equals more output. If production falls, add more workers, more hours, more raw materials. This worked when resources were abundant and growth was the only metric. It stopped working when efficiency mattered. Assumption 2, the center knows best. Planners in Moscow were presumed to have better information than those on the ground. In reality, they had worse information, filtered through layers of bureaucracy, each with its own incentives to distort. Assumption 3, the system can adjust itself. When problems emerged, the response was always internal recalibration. New quotas, new ministries, new campaigns. The structure itself remained untouchable. These assumptions created feedback loops. Managers learned to game the system. A furniture factory assigned a target in tons produced heavy furniture. When the target shifted to units produced, they made miniatures. When quality metrics were added, inspectors were bribed or became part of the production chain themselves. The system optimized for the appearance of success rather than actual results. And because the appearance was what mattered for advancement, the system selected for those who could maintain the illusion most effectively. The 1970s revealed the cost of those hidden assumptions. The global economy was shifting. Computers were replacing assembly lines. Information technology was becoming as valuable as steel production. The Soviet system had no mechanism to recognize this, much less adapt to it. When oil prices spiked in the 1970s, Soviet revenues surged. This appeared to validate the system. In reality, it masked deepening structural problems. Revenue from energy exports substituted for genuine productivity. The economy became dependent on a commodity it didn't control. Meanwhile, the information problem intensified. A modern economy requires rapid feedback, markets discovering prices, consumers signaling preferences, producers adjusting in real time. Central planning required the opposite: stability, predictability, control. The more complex the economy became, the less the center could know. The Afghan War illustrated the feedback failure. Military reports showed progress. Casualty numbers were managed. Victory was always imminent. The reality, stalemate, demoralization, mounting costs, never reached decision-makers in a form that could trigger course correction. The system had no mechanism to acknowledge failure, while it could still be addressed. By 1985, the Soviet Union faced a choice it couldn't articulate: continue the existing structure and guarantee eventual collapse, or reform the structure and risk immediate collapse. The system had selected for leaders who couldn't process this dilemma. Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost and perestroika, were an attempt to fix the feedback problem without dismantling the structure. It was already too late. Opening information channels revealed the gap between reported reality and actual conditions. The illusion collapsed faster than any alternative could be built. Once the feedback failure became visible, the system entered a cascade. Each component that had maintained stability became an accelerant of collapse. The loyalty over competence principle meant there were no capable managers to handle the transition. Those who had succeeded under the old incentives were precisely those least equipped to operate under new ones. The vertical reporting structure meant that when the center weakened, there was no lateral coordination. Republics didn't negotiate with each other. They had only ever reported upward. When upward stopped functioning, the connections simply severed. The output target system meant there was no genuine price discovery. When markets were suddenly introduced, no one knew what anything was actually worth. Decades of accumulated distortions manifested at once. The military-industrial complex discovered it had been producing weapons no one would buy and consuming resources that could have built a functioning economy. The space program that had symbolized Soviet achievement was revealed to be a prestige project draining capital from basic infrastructure. The most telling dynamic: the harder Gorbachev tried to reform the system, the faster it disintegrated. Because the system wasn't a set of policies that could be adjusted. It was a self-reinforcing structure where every element depended on every other element remaining in place. By 1991, the collapse was mechanical, not driven by revolution or invasion, but by the exhaustion of a system that had consumed its own foundation. The Soviet collapse offers a lesson that extends beyond economic systems. Any structure that prioritizes stability over feedback will eventually face this dilemma. Organizations that reward the appearance of success over actual results will accumulate hidden failures until the gap becomes unbridgeable. Systems that punish messengers for bad news will lose the ability to course-correct while correction is still possible. Structures that select for loyalty over competence will find themselves managed by people who cannot handle crisis. The warning signs are consistent across contexts. When reporting becomes more important than results. When complexity increases but decision-making remains centralized. When the response to every problem is to reinforce the existing structure rather than question its assumptions. The Soviet Union's industrial might, its nuclear arsenal, its territorial control, none of these prevented collapse because they were outputs of the system, not foundations of it. When the underlying structure failed, everything built on top of it failed simultaneously. This is the nature of systemic collapse. It appears sudden because the deterioration happens internally, invisible to outside observers and often to those inside the system itself. By the time the failure becomes obvious, the point of possible intervention has long passed. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Its specific structure and context are historical, but the dynamics that consumed it are not. Feedback loops, information flow, incentive structures, the gap between reported reality and actual conditions. These operate in every organization, every institution, every system humans build. The question isn't whether the Soviet model was uniquely flawed. The question is, what structures today are operating on hidden assumptions? Where is feedback being filtered rather than heard? Which systems are selecting for the appearance of success rather than its substance? The Soviet collapse wasn't a failure of ideology, it was a failure of structure. And structures, unlike ideologies, don't announce their assumptions. They hide them in processes that seem natural until they're not. The system didn't collapse because it was weak. It collapsed because its strength had become incompatible with adaptation. And by the time anyone inside could see that clearly, there was no one left with the authority to act on it.